Senator from Beaufort, what purpose you ask?
To be heard on the amendment.
Recognized to be heard on the amendment. Senator from Beaufort.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, just to refresh your recollection from last Thursday, this particular amendment that's on the desk is the so-called PACE amendment, which is an alternate way, in addition to the ESA method, an alternate way of soliciting monies that can then subsequently be used to fund scholarship awards to students. And if you'll recall, the amendment provides for 4 separate buckets of tax credits or authorized tax credits, $25 million for exceptional needs students, $25 million for disadvantaged students, $40 million for PACE scholarship students, which is really another way of saying any eligible student, and then $10 million for homeschooling. And I laid out the policy reasons for that amendment last Thursday. I won't go into them into depth right now, but primarily the reason I offered it up is the tax credit approach, or this PACE scholarship approach, is unquestionably constitutional. There is a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Arizona Christian Schools Tuition Organization versus Arizona in 2011, that clearly holds that these tax credits are an authorized way of providing choice to private and parochial schools, and that the monies are not public monies. So for that reason, I offered this up, because it does stand in contrast to the ESA, which is a little more problematic in my opinion. I understand a lot of work has been done to make it constitutional, but a little more problematic in my view. So that's why I offered this up as an amendment. Also offered it up simply because I don't think the scale of competition that the ESA contemplates is enough to affect the sort of public policy changes that the proponents hope. 5,000 in the first year out of 750,000 total students, K-12 in the state. That's less than 1%. And even after it's fully phased into 15,000, you only get up to 2%. I don't think that's enough to make a material difference in terms of competition. Also offered up the PACE amendment that's on the desk right now, because homeschooling was not a beneficiary under the ESA, and I felt like to provide relief and to empower parents throughout the state of South Carolina, it was good to have a homeschooling component. And lastly, the amount of the scholarships in the PACE amendment that would be awarded to disadvantaged and exceptional need kids would be 11,000 as opposed to 6. It was my view that that really empowers families of lesser means to a degree that 6,000 as contemplated by ESA would not. So over the last 4 days, as you'll recall, on Thursday, the majority leader took the podium and expressed support for this approach, expressed support, quite frankly, for both the ESA and the PACE approach. I think he viewed, and rightly so, that these are 2 things that can work in tandem with each other, and that adopting one doesn't necessarily mean the exclusion of the other. And he noted from the podium a few questions that he had in regard to the language of the amendment and the language of the PACE bill itself that's currently in the Finance Committee, and raised good questions, quite frankly. Some of the questions that he raised are questions that typically would be addressed in a subcommittee context. For instance, the amount of the tax credits, both in the aggregate of $100 million and in the constituent parts in terms of the 25, 25, 40, 10 breakdown between exceptional needs, disadvantaged kids, PACE scholarship, and homeschool. And I think that there are legitimate points raised in regard to maybe putting more emphasis on regard to those of lesser means, those that have students with exceptional needs. And again, these are typically things that will be flushed out at the subcommittee level. There were also some questions that the majority leader raised in regard to the, and quite frankly, questions that I have myself upon reflection about the scholarship funding organization component. For instance, the number of SFOs. This PACE amendment that's on the desk right now doesn't contemplate any cap on the number of SFOs that would be going out and soliciting these donations. Other states have experimented with caps on the number of SFOs. Others have had no caps. And I think there is a legitimate question as to what is the best mechanism in that regard in terms of raising the money. The question in regard to the compensation to the SFOs, is 5% an appropriate amount? Should it be something more? Should it be something less? I think that it is appropriate to make some inquiries in regard to what are the reasonable administrative costs that SFOs would incur and what is a reasonable amount of compensation to pay for those efforts. Again, these are things that could be fleshed out at the subcommittee level. There's also a mechanism in the current PACE amendment that provides for the treasurer to screen and approve entities that apply to become scholarship funding organizations. There's a question as to what should that criteria be. What should the evaluation process consist of? Again, that's something that needs to be explored further, I think. A question in regard to, and Senator from Lexington, I think you mentioned this to me, in regard to the individuals or entities that could actually claim the credits. Do we want to have any restrictions at all? Do you want to have no cap so that, one entity could use up pretty much all the credits if it wanted to, or do you want to have some sort of an equitable allocation or a set aside in regard to other individuals who might want to donate? I think that's something we can explore as well. There's also some questions in regard to how the scholarship funding organizations, once they solicit the donations and the taxpayers take their credits, what's the process whereby those SFOs actually make the awards of scholarships to students? I think that some testimony in regard to that process would be appropriate as well. Also, whether or not $11,000 is an appropriate amount. I think there's a legitimate debate about whether or not the approach that the ESA takes, which is keeping it at $6,000 to thereby expand the number of students that can benefit, is that better than the $11,000 per child contemplated by the PACE amendment, which correspondingly would decrease the number? I think that's something that needs to be explored further. I think that even though this tax credit approach has been upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in that Arizona case I talked about in 2011, I think there is a likelihood, given today's environment, that even this particular scholarship bill will probably be challenged on some level by those that don't want to provide choices outside the traditional K-12 context. And I think that it's prudent on our part to anticipate what those challenges might be and to make sure this bill contains provisions that allow the best possible case or chance for this being held as constitutional. And so all of those things argue in favor of letting this go through the subcommittee process as the ESA bill did. The reason that I offered this up as an amendment to a bill that's before us right now is because too often in the General Assembly, at least it's been my experience over the last 14 years, that when the General Assembly takes on a topic, for instance, education choice, as this ESA bill is, once they pass it, there seems to be a tendency to move on to other things, that we've already taken that up, we've checked the box, we've done education for this year, and we're going to move on to something else. I am satisfied that is not the case in regard to this tax credit scholarship approach. And as evidence for that, the majority leader last Thursday stood in the well of the Senate and frankly stated to the public that there was support for passing this bill. The votes are there to pass that bill. I think that's also reflected by the number of individuals who are sponsors of this particular amendment. The Senate Finance Chairman, to his credit, has offered to set up, give this an immediate subcommittee hearing or as soon as practicable. And the subcommittee chair, to whom I think it's going to be assigned, Senator from Dorchester, has indicated a willingness to take this up quickly, to receive testimony, and to get work product out to the full Senate Finance Committee as quickly as is practicable. And I I appreciate those actions. And so for all of those reasons, because there is some work to be done on this bill to answer the questions that I've just outlined, and because there is this resolve on the part of the leadership in this Senate to move this through the subcommittee process, I am persuaded that the best course of action and the best chance of having this bill pass, which after all is what we want to have done, is to have this amendment withdrawn. In a moment, I'm going to make a unanimous consent motion to have it withdrawn, and then we can proceed to whatever amendment is next on the ESA bill, which I anticipate supporting in due course. So, Mr. President, I have a unanimous consent request.
State your request.
Unanimous consent that this particular Amendment 10A be withdrawn.
Is objection to the withdrawal of Amendment 10A? Hearing none, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator from Beaufort. Senator from Lexington.